You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. Good to see you, Mike and Geoff.
Good to see you too.
We emerged from the budget lockup
I know.
last week.
You're blinking into the light, just emerging back into the real world. How are you feeling?
Well, I think Geoff and I were, feeling a little punchy coming out of there, but we have had a different experience inside lockup, perhaps, in terms of our interpretation of events.
Yeah, I don't know if we settled the argument. I'd like to come back to, was it an austerity budget? But that's later. That's the strategy suite. And guests, we'll be talking a bit about that, chaos in the Conservative caucus, what's ahead for them. And we'll also talk about what's happening federally with the Liberals. So now that the Liberals have a new leader, what's going to happen federally with the election. So, and the various parties, what they need to do. First, Let's welcome to our podcast for the first time Trevor Tombe. He's here to talk to us about tariffs and break down last week's BC budget. Trevor Tombe is a professor at the University of Calgary's Department of Economics and the director of Fiscal and Economic Policy at the School of Public Policy. But hey, he's also a British Columbian, so we can claim him as one of our in-house economists at Hotel Pacifico, I think. He was an undergrad at SFU before ultimately receiving his PhD at the University of Toronto. He speaks out regularly on government finances, international trade, and fiscal policy through various channels. He's exactly the guy we need to talk to at this moment in time, with a tariff war, a recently tabled BC budget, and just a lot of economic uncertainty, I'll call it. Welcome to Hotel Pacifico, Trevor.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, no, it's great. Now, I'm sorry, there's a lot to talk about in terms of your expertise, but right now we need to settle up on your BC bona fides, because I feel like Mike McDonald was under the impression that you were from Maple Ridge, and that might not be right.
Yeah, I'm mainly from Pitt Meadows. Lived there for most of my formative years. Did live briefly in Maple Ridge, and I did go to high school in Maple Ridge.
With
Usworth. Yeah, out in Hammond. And
Hammond's in Maple Ridge. Yeah. Hammond's Maple Ridge.
Yeah.
We'll call
this
it.
is a really,
yeah.
Okay.
This is important to me.
Now these roots, I should say, these roots are important, because going to high school in Maple Ridge is why I'm an economist today.
Say more.
Yes.
Say more.
Because Maple Ridge, unlike most towns, has a Nobel Prize winning economist.
Oh,
right.
There we go.
Robert Mundell, Nobel Prize winning economist. And I was in high school at the time that he won the prize. And I'm not quite sure if it was like a direct connection, but that's when they started to roll out some economics classes in high school. I had the impression that it was because he won. They thought they'd lean into it. And I was hooked from that point forward.
Oh my gosh.
It just goes to show you a lot of great people come out of Maple Ridge, right?
So,
has anybody ever denied that?
Larry Walker.
No, not a subject of debate. Not a subject of debate. All right.
Anyways,
yeah. And
we could do a whole podcast on Maple Ridge people. So we'll
if Mike has his way, we will too. We will too. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more. Like I do, in your area of expertise, like really lends well to talking about the budget that came out last week. But I want to take a minute. We have to talk about tariffs. Trevor, I'm sorry. Like, I'm sure he nods like resignedly, like we know. So I'm wondering, where are we in the sort of the experience of these tariffs? Like, I think we're starting to see some impacts from the dispute. And can you tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing now and maybe what we can expect to come next?
Sure. So it seems like each hour that goes by, the trade landscape with the U.S. changes. I mean, even today, there was a tit for tat with Ontario Premier Ford on electricity export surcharges. Trump then wanting to double steel and aluminum tariffs, which will come in tomorrow, March 12th, up to 50% in response to that. And they've since backed down from that. But one thing has been ever present for many weeks and months now, and that's heightened uncertainty. Nobody, as individuals, businesses, even governments, really know where we're headed. And kind of it seems like the U.S. government doesn't even know where it's headed on some of these policy issues either. So high uncertainty is really what's having the most significant impact right now on the Canadian economy. Uncertainty is naturally going to lead businesses to potentially and prudently pause some large-scale investments, especially in export-intensive areas, waiting until some of that uncertainty is resolved. And there's different measures of this. One that I really like to point to is a measure of uncertainty across various countries put out by a team of economists in the States, Nick Bloom, Scott Baker, and others at policyuncertainty.com if your listeners want to go there. And uncertainty is high everywhere. It's not just a Canadian specific thing, but it is especially high in Canada. Their measure, we're about 500% higher than we were in February.
Wow.
One can
Wow.
quibble with that index, but it's definitely higher and we all feel it. So with lower investment, you might have households even increasing the amount of precautionary savings, especially those employed in export intensive sectors. And so I think it's going to be hard to avoid a slowdown in economic activity this year, even if tariffs ultimately don't get enacted across the board, just because this uncertainty, lowering investment considerably, that'll slow labor markets, slow GDP growth, slow income growth, potentially lead to higher prices too. Some of our retaliatory measures may have that effect as well. So this uncertainty, this moment's very real, even absent a 25% broad across the board tariff.
Is there one metric you're looking for, one number one output maybe that you think will give us an indication of, like, to your point about some of how the uncertainty is affecting us? Is we can't quantify it yet. We don't know. Is there a juncture where you think we'll be really seeing the impact of this uncertainty?
It will see it potentially in a really big way in business investment. And we get that data from Statistics Canada roughly every quarter is when the good quality data there comes out. And so when we get the first quarter of this year come out, I suspect quite strongly that it'll show a drop relative to the end of 2024 and potentially a large drop. Historically, when uncertainty rises, we see investment falling. And when uncertainty rises by an amount roughly equivalent to what we saw during the financial crisis, then investment declines by about 6% or so, just to give you a sense of magnitude that some of the research has identified. But we're talking about now roughly quadruple the amount of uncertainty that we saw at the time of the financial crisis. So investments declining on the order of 25% wouldn't be crazy. Now, of course, we'll have to wait to see what that data shows, but it'll almost surely be significant.
When I look at how BC tried to hedge against dependence on the United States historically, it was by developing exports to Asia, particularly China. So gas, coal, and a lot of food, agricultural products, and that kind of thing. Now we're also in a tariff argument with China. And if we tried to have a better relationship with China, that would even more infuriate the United States. Do you think some doors are closing on us here in terms of trying to find ways through this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you're right to note that BC trading with the United States to a lesser extent than we see in many other provinces. And then that does insulate it. So Ontario, Alberta, roughly 40%, or trade with the United States is equivalent to roughly 40% of their economies. And it's far less in British Columbia, less also in Quebec. And so one might think that makes it less exposed to the negative implications of a trade shock. And at the margin, yeah, it would be. But we have very deeply interconnected national supply chains. That means there will be employment implications of export declines in Ontario manufacturing because we have a lot of individuals across the country who are suppliers to those exporters. And so these indirect effects are quite large. And yeah. So the BC won't be spared, even if the change in real GDP there and employment there is a little bit less than what you see elsewhere. Now, I guess all that with a big caveat that we've never seen trade policy change as broadly or as sharply as it is right now ever since the 1930s, when the nature of trade and the two economies were just fundamentally different. And so we don't really know exactly what to expect or how businesses might respond. Researchers, so I've done some work on this, major financial institutions, Bank of Canada's released some analysis. We're trying to model what the impacts might be, and we're doing the best that we can, but without a lot of direct experience, it's really hard to be precise about what might be in store for BC versus Ontario versus others.
The government's announced 18 projects that they say they will fast track through the permitting process. I think over half of those are wind energy projects that they're just basically, selling back into BC Hydro. But for export projects, mining, LNG, those present an opportunity to diversify, given that those markets are Asian. And I'm just wondering how realistic you think it is to attract investment to actually get these projects to FID, go beyond that list and develop other natural resource opportunities when we've before this tariff war came along, we weren't moving at a terribly fast pace on it.
Yeah, trade diversification is certainly something that's receiving renewed attention, naturally, with disruption with the United States. And trading to other countries is an opportunity there, especially since we have new trade agreements, still relatively new trade agreements that are being phased in, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Canada-EU trade agreement, CETA. That presents an opportunity for both exporters and importers in Canada with those markets. And there are large markets outside of China in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the physical ability of us to increase exports, especially of resources, is really heavily constrained. And it will be for some time. So the Port of Vancouver, for example, has now gone through and received approvals for a pretty major expansion there. I don't believe they've made the final investment decision yet, but
Roberts Bank Container Port, is that what you're
exactly,
referring to?
exactly.
Yeah,
Terminal
they've
2.
got their
T3.
federal approval. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or RBT2, Roberts Bank Terminal 2.
That's right. Once they get going, though, that'll still take some time to complete. And until that physical capability to actually trade more volume broad, then it'll be really tough to increase trade diversification in any meaningful degree. And it's not just the Port of Vancouver, Port of Montreal right now going through the regulatory process to expand very significantly there as well. So trade diversification means more infrastructure, more transportation infrastructure, more ports, more rail. And that needs to come prior to increasing in any material way resource projects right across the country.
Guests, we've been talking for a few weeks now about TELUS's commitment to social impact and sustainability. This week, I want to focus on a new program they've launched that could be helpful if you've had the experience of looking at your energy bill and seeing a weird spike that you can't explain. Is it just me, or is that most of us? The problem in my house is by the time we see the spike, it's long enough ago that we're a bit baffled at how to explain it. And if you care at all about optimizing your home energy use, which again, isn't that most of us, it can feel like a missed opportunity. Which is why presenting sponsor TELUS has launched Smart Energy, a global-first solution that helps Canadians manage their home energy consumption more effectively, saving up to 15% on their energy bills and reducing their environmental footprint, all through one simple app. To further benefit the environment, TELUS is planting 4 trees per year on behalf of each Smart Energy subscriber. For more information and to explore how much you can save every year with Smart Energy, visit telus.com/smartenergy. So another topic that's come up that maybe, that there's bigger consensus on than there was previously is just interprovincial trade. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, from your standpoint, I know Canadian economists have been talking about this for a while and the need to move it. I mean, what do you think the prospects are that will actually be able to meaningfully reduce those barriers and create better trade between the provinces?
Yeah, that's one very notable aspect of federal provincial discussions right now is how central interprovincial trade issues have become in recent weeks. And I think that's because it is related to trade diversification. We can think about exporting and importing more from Japan or Australia, but we can also think about importing and exporting more from each other in different parts of the country. And in principle, some of the gains from trade are available even domestically. Highly productive firms can expand to cover more of the Canadian market. Different regions can better specialize in areas that they're particularly good at. Labor mobility restrictions are also related to interprovincial trade issues. And I've seen commitments now by governments that exceed even the most ambitious previous agreements. We've had commitments recently around mutually recognizing trucking regulations, which might sound really niche, but it's incredibly important in that a majority of the goods that we trade with each other within Canada are by truck. And if rules and regulations differ from one province to the next, that adds costs to the truckers. And that adds costs then to the price that they charge to ship. And that just cascades through the supply chain. But most of what we trade interprovincially is not a physical good, but a service. And a lot of the barriers to services relate to professional credentials recognition, like your ability to provide a service to a client in another province might be inhibited if you are not appropriately registered and certified in that other province. But we've seen now a commitment by governments to, prior to June 1st, have a broad mutual recognition agreement in place for professional credentials. And there's hundreds of occupations where this is quite relevant. We've also seen an agreement, although devil in the details here, around interprovincial trade in alcohol, which is important for many provinces, BC in particular, with its wine industry and the ability to export that to other parts of Canada. So there's been really encouraging moves, like really ambitious moves by Canadian governments recently, and that can, in principle, have pretty significant productivity and economic growth benefits for the country. My own work in this area suggests that if we could eliminate all of the policy relevant interprovincial trade costs, overall economic activity could rise by between 4 to 8% or so.
Wow.
And that's quite large.
So who are the losers?
Well, there's always
somebody's got to be losing, or else
That's right.
this would have happened already, right?
Yeah, let me circle back to that point. Just let me give some context around the size of those gains relative to the disruption from the US. And estimates vary in terms of what a 25% trade war might mean. But so I'll point to the Bank of Canada as this is the most recent and perhaps most authoritative for many. They have a total cumulative reduction in the size of the economy by about 4%. And so interprovincial liberalization could, over time, generate gains that are larger than the costs of lost access to or lost free access to the US market. And so I think that's why governments are focused on it so clearly right now. Now,
that's an astounding juxtaposition.
And it would take time, of course. This is not like snap your fingers and the economy is suddenly 8% bigger. We're talking years where the adjustment would take place. There's no avoiding short-term disruption and costs from a trade war with the US. But to Mike's point about losers, there is always winners and losers. It almost doesn't matter what policy you're talking about. There's trade-offs, always winners and losers. Trade's an area where that's fairly clear because often you know whether you're in an unproductive firm facing limited import competition, in this case from perhaps more productive firms in other provinces. And if we ease barriers, that may create employment losses at lower productivity firms or parts of the country that don't have a particular advantage in an area where they currently have activity. So there's absolutely going to be contractions in some firms, maybe complete shutdowns of some in different parts of the country as they're being replaced by higher productivity firms located elsewhere. So that's a challenge. A second challenge, or maybe, I'll say three. A second challenge is around the provincial credentialing bodies themselves. Internal trade, it's not like we're levying tariffs or quotas. It's just that rules are different from one part of the country to another, and navigating different rules and simultaneously complying with them is more costly than if there is just one set.
It's a regulatory tariff.
It's a regulatory. Exactly. But to mutually recognize, if provinces were to say, hey, your credential is as good as mine, that does limit the independent authority of provinces in different areas. They cede a little bit of their autonomy, if you will. It kind of weakens the power of some of these regulatory bodies. And some raise concerns that this might create a kind of race to the bottom dynamic. I don't share those concerns, but you can see that it might be in the interest of a province to say, hey, we're going to adopt weak regulations to try and attract businesses. And then because of these mutual recognition agreements, they can then send their product or service out to others. So that's one potential risk. Another is that regulatory differences might exist for a reason. Mm-hmm. And if we kind of smooth those differences out, then we might get regulations that are not appropriately tailored to local circumstances. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how governments navigate that. And I think they are aware of these challenges, but the current moment has simply meant that governments have increased the weight that they place on economic outcomes relative to these other risks, or has potentially made governments a little less risk averse, willing to gamble a little bit now than they would have been comfortable with in previous times.
Well, now, Trevor, you're making me think. Sorry, I just want to stay on that and say, because you're realizing for me, Trevor, there's an assumption I've made in this discussion that I'm curious. Is it true or not? There's an assumption I've made that the barriers to interprovincial trade, for example, in Canada, are more onerous than what would exist within the states between the states, which is kind of interesting because that kind of regulatory power, legislative power, is a big part of the U.S. model. So, is it fair? Like, are we just besieged with this because of this moment, or are we comparatively more barriers internally to trade?
Yeah, so there's some research on this. I should say that the internal trade data in the States is not as good as in Canada, but researchers that use comparable methods try and estimate these trade barriers in goods specifically. So put services aside, because that's where the US data has some real problems, and Canada does a lot better job. But for goods, we have measurable barriers within goods between provinces, and those same methods applied to the States don't seem to estimate anything that's statistically different than zero. And so it's an interesting question on why that's the case. One potential reason is that the states actually aren't more powerful than Canadian provinces. They are in some ways, like they have criminal law power there and we don't here. But economically, the Interstate Commerce Clause gives the federal government a lot more power, and we don't have something comparable here. And so for a lot of spheres of economic activity, there just isn't the same type of regulatory barrier there that exists here. Many states, I forget the exact number, but something on the order of 36 or so. So a majority of states already have these kind of broad credential recognition where if you're registered in one state, you're good to go automatically in another. So they've also enacted policy choices in areas where states have discretion far beyond what we've done in Canada, although it looks like maybe we'll be catching up on those fronts.
I was just going to say that an interesting example, I think, in a trucking case, we already have the workers crossing provincial boundaries. So there's a lot of alignment probably in place already. And maybe I'm wrong about that. But I think about the healthcare case where if a province decided to recognize a Philippine nursing degree as acceptable for Canada, that would put the downward pressure you're talking about on every province to do the same thing. And I think those are some of the areas that have been most intractable, especially healthcare and some of the other professions.
Yeah, and you're right to flag that. The devil will be in the details around what these mutual recognition agreements actually look like. But for them to commit to having something that allows for the free provision of services right across the country, no matter where you're registered, and the free movement within Canada by June 1st, that's really ambitious. But something that we'll have to pay close attention to when they actually announce what those details are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's get into it on the budget.
Yeah.
You know what? What's your take? No leading question. What's your take?
Just an open-ended question.
Yeah, I mean, I feel for any government right now putting together a fiscal plan for an entire fiscal year, actually 3 years ahead. It's hard to plan 3 hours ahead these days, let alone 3 years. And so, point number one, really uncertain moment. And any budget that we're seeing right now, unlikely to pan out exactly as governments expect. I think that's fair to say. And budgets as political documents, it's really hard for governments to cut through all the other ongoing developments. Like the amount of attention, I think is fair to say, that was paid not just to the BC budget, but the Alberta budget as well, far, far less than would normally be the case. So initial reaction, just sympathy for a government and for those who are working on the budget. But my take is that this continues the same kind of a trend that BC has been on for the past several budgets, and that's increasing the amount of spending that is there on various, not just operating spending, but also capital expenditures in a way that's not just growing faster than inflation and population, but growing faster than the economy itself, and not being funded through similar increases in revenues. And so we're seeing ever higher levels of public debt that I think is approaching a level that I don't want to say concerning. And we can dig into like what might actually make it concerning, but it's at a level that's leading me to think a little bit differently about BC's financial situation. We have now in this budget a debt projection that is going to lead the province to be very similar to your typical maritime province in terms of its overall debt to GDP. Now, BC having a debt level that's similar to the Maritimes,
Are you
that's
talking about the trend? Because right now we're still below Ontario and Quebec.
that's right. I'm looking at the 2027 net debt
You're turning where it's
projection.
going. Okay.
Exactly where it's going. That in 3 short years, and it's been ratcheting up from here. So taxpayer supported debt right now for this year, they think they're going to end this fiscal year at about 27% of GDP in terms of the overall amount of taxpayer supported debt. Last year in the budget, they thought we would be ending this year, so the 25-26 debt, at about 25% of GDP. So they've already ratcheted up relative to their own plans by 2 full percentage points. And if we go back to the the budget of 2023, they had a projected debt to GDP for this year for BC of 23%. So we've ratcheted up by 4 full percentage points of GDP just relative to the government's own plans for this year, 2025-26. And the cause of that is not lower revenues, it's higher spending. And there's pros and cons. I don't mean to suggest that's good or bad. That's just arithmetically what's behind the increase in the debt. And there's trade-offs there, but it's deviating from their past spending plans by increasing them faster than what they were planning for, increasing them faster than inflation and population, and indeed increasing them faster than kind of what they committed to. So last year, they were, I guess, planning and targeting for a real per capita spending reduction this year, and then another spending reduction in 2026-27. But it turns out that now they increased the overall amount of per capita spending faster than inflation.
But are
recommitting now to lowering spending next year and the year after. So they've previously committed to lower spending, didn't follow through, and now they're just doing that again. But what makes this budget new is that they have flagged in a new section in the budget a sustainability section. Like there is a sustainability concern if debt to GDP just keeps on rising. The government's aware of it enough to put a section of the budget on sustainability, but really not presenting much in terms of how they'll get to sustainability other than, again, committing to lowering real per capita spending. But they've done that before and never followed through.
Is it legitimate? I mean, the rationale the government offers, and you've pointed to it, is that we're still in the better performers in terms of debt to GDP, and we want to stay there. So they had the declining deficit year over year was one so-called guardrail. The second was we want to stay sort of in the top 3 or 4 of best in class. Does the second one in particular hold water at all in your mind, that it's possible to do that and make a prediction that you can do that?
So what matters for sustainability is how quickly debt is growing relative to the economy as a whole. Since that's a good measure of the overall amount of resources that society has to carry and manage those public debts, and it's kind of the government's ability to pay, since it can tap into that through tax rate choices. And debt to GDP is not just rising in this budget, but it's rising at a higher trajectory than the past budget, which itself was rising at a higher trajectory than the budget before that. So debt to GDP is rising, and it's rising faster and faster, not just relative to the past, but relative to the government's own plans. And now with the projection for 2027, having a debt to GDP of nearly 35%, that's quite concerning. Like that's a real change relative to the debt to GDP that prevailed not too long ago. Pre-COVID, it was about 15%.
Well, can we talk briefly about revenue? Because this is one that I scratched my head about. It's a political question as much as it is an economic one. But accepting that the driver is increased spending, and the government says it'll make an effort to reduce spending. We can argue whether or not they'll be successful. Is there any room to increase revenue on the taxation side at any point? Because the resource revenues that the provincial budget has relied on are not looking good in forestry in particular, and they're very vulnerable to the tariff battle. So, is there any room at all to raise taxes?
Yeah, you're right to note the challenge in natural resource revenues. That's an area that is historically quite important, forestry in particular. This year, it's just a little over 600 million or so, if I remember correctly, and that's projected to decline. Sorry, it's been declining relative to where it was pre-COVID. And natural gas, though, that's an area of interesting increase that the province is seeing. So overall, and natural resource royalties are pretty volatile. And I'm speaking to you from Alberta. I know we know that here all too well. In terms of tax revenues, there is scope to increase revenue through tax rate changes, but the politics is really difficult. So provinces have a hard, yeah, I'm going to say sales taxes. I'm going to suggest maybe a harmonized sales tax, which creates its own separate.
How big of
can
a
of
hole
worms.
will the carbon tax looks like it's on its final legs here.
Yeah,
Um,
that's an interesting point. So BC isn't itself one of the backstop provinces. It levies a carbon tax as a provincial policy choice, and I don't know whether
well,
that
EB
will
said that
continue.
he'll remove it once the federal backstop's gone.
Oh,
And
okay.
Carney
Yeah,
has said he will. So,
yeah.
I mean, I guess and there'll be an election. So whoever wins, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
so that's
gone.
it'll depend on what they mean by remove it, because there's multiple types of carbon prices.
Yeah,
And there's still going to be one federally. I suspect even if
yeah.
Polyev wins federally, although I don't want to bet too strongly on this, but they would maintain a large emitter system to some degree. So I don't know. But right now, carbon taxation revenue for British Columbia is about $3 billion. And so if it's just
Mhm.
eliminated, just wholesale,
Well,
then
they're probably going to focus on the consumer, quote unquote, consumer carbon tax, and
mhm.
would that be
Mhm.
about half of it, probably?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have
Yeah.
those numbers off
So there's
the
probably
top
a
of my head.
billion to two
Then the
billion
net
dollar hole in the
revenues from the
budget.
large emitter systems tend to actually be fairly small, because what we
Yeah.
do with most of the implicit revenues there is kind of recycle that back to industry in the form of what are called output-based allocations, or I like to call them just output subsidies. And those can be pretty big, 80 to 95% or so of the total actual implicit carbon revenues that are being raised. So it's not actually leaving much for governments.
Mhm.
So the retail level tax, that is the one that generates most of the revenue.
Hmm. Dare I suggest we may need the HST, Jeff?
Well, I think that that's one of those interesting ones when it was proposed by Gordon Campbell in a political context that was unacceptable,
Mhm.
it cratered and finished off his career. But we look around today, and as Trevor's been pointing out, we see things that were unthinkable 3 weeks ago happening in 24 hours.
Mhm.
You know, the national recognition of all of these professional standards, you know, that's a big, big, big deal. And the HST one, who knows? It certainly made economic sense. What I was fascinated recently was that Trump objected to the existing GST and HST as part of his tirade against us, although there's a lot of loose pieces in his thinking on everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet against anything anymore in terms of some of these policies.
Yeah. So the HST's main strength is that it's a value added tax. It is on final goods and services. It's not levied in the supply chain on intermediates again and again and again, which has compounding effects and lowers the return on investments as well. And so shifting to an HST tends to decrease the effective tax that we're putting on new investment in a jurisdiction. And it's pretty large in terms of its effect. So it would also improve BC's overall economic competitiveness and be more attractive as an export destination. Although, because the two tax bases differ, that's also a source of political challenge, where what the PST doesn't cover now, subject to the GST, you'd see that GST rate rise. And there's no way to perfectly structure a transition where you wouldn't see tax increases on some goods. And so it's a challenge to navigate. But I think it's been long enough that maybe there is a way to navigate. And then having the federal government manage it all. It just makes it easier on businesses for compliance. BC wouldn't have to worry about enforcement or anything like that, so save some money there.
Guess another pop quiz from Fortis BC coming to you today. You know, there's nothing more I like to talk about than science. Now, that would be political science, but today I've got some real science, and you're going to have to reach way back to your high school chemistry class for this one. What is the chemical compound CH4 known as? CH4. Any of you know that? Because I know most of you are like me, probably spending more time in arts classes than science classes, but here's a hint. It means this compound has one carbon atom bonded to 4 hydrogen atoms, CH4. And what do you call that? The answer, methane, or most folks call it natural gas. Now, next question. What would happen if we developed a process to separate those carbon atoms from the hydrogen atoms? Well, I personally don't have a clue, but the answer is you would have a process that produces low carbon hydrogen. And that's what our sponsor, Fortis BC, who does know a lot about this stuff, is working toward. Last year, Fortis BC began testing new technology at one of their sites in the Kootenays with the goal of bringing a large-scale hydrogen production facility to BC. The pilot project was enabled by funding from the province of BC's Clean BC Industry Fund and is a partnership between Fortis BC and the Hazer Group, an Australian technology firm. Referred to as the Hazer process, this new hydrogen technology uses a process known as pyrolysis to break apart natural gas into both hydrogen and solid carbon. The hydrogen can then be used in the existing gas system, while the solid carbon could be used in myriad commercial and industrial applications. And it is yet another example of how harnessing the strengths of the existing gas system will support the decarbonization objectives of Fortis BC and the province. Innovative technologies such as the Hazer process have the potential to create new economic opportunities. With testing in the Kootenays now complete, Fortis BC and Hazer are looking for a potential site in BC for a commercial-scale Hazer hydrogen plant. Fortis BC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast. In your experience, when provinces get into, or federal government gets into situations where the debt is going on a unsustainable trajectory, some will say, the best option is to grow your way out of it and just super crank the economy. But I mean, it doesn't seem realistic to be able to reverse the trajectory unless some element of spending restraint, or at least slowing spending to below the rate of revenue growth or below the economic growth. What does your experience tell you that has been one of the most effective recipes for provinces to kind of get to a steadier state?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because to stabilize a debt to GDP trajectory, you do that in a number of ways. You could do it through increasing economic growth, but it's really hard for governments to move the needle there to a large extent. You can nudge growth through policy. You could have the most efficient tax structure you can imagine, drop interprovincial trade barriers, have dramatically improved education and infrastructure and so on. And you're talking tenths of a point on GDP growth. That over time, compounds, and that can grow to fairly large numbers, but it's really difficult for governments to pull that lever as a way to address fiscal sustainability issues. You have to look at policy choices around either spending or taxes. Now, which taxes? Well, some might be maxed out. So there is a limit to how much revenue can be raised through tax increases, because each time you ratchet up a rate, the tax base shrinks, and it gets to a point where that shrinkage, what we call the behavioral effect, is as large as the mechanical effect of raising tax rates itself, where any further increase doesn't really deliver much. BC is not there overall, and I'd say that sales taxes would still have quite a good yield to them in terms of tax changes. But let's think about how big of a fiscal adjustment BC might need to sustain its overall financial position. So there's different estimates out there. I'll turn to the Parliamentary Budget Office. They do this every year for every government in Canada. They look long term. Where's the debt to GDP growing? And if it's just rising without bound, that's a problem. And then they estimate what's the fiscal adjustment required to stabilize that debt level. And BC's case, their latest estimate is that BC would need to either increase revenues or decrease spending by an amount equivalent to about 1.8% of GDP. That's enormous. That is enormous. My own estimates that I put out through Finances of the Nation, .ca. I'll plug that right there.
Say that again.
Finances of the Nation,
Okay.
one word, .ca. It also has a debt sustainability tool there, and you can choose your own kind of scenarios and play around a little bit. And a scenario that's kind of comparable to the PBO gets a little larger of a number than 1.8. But even if we take the PBO 1.8, that's large. The entire BC education spending, all in, is 2.5% of GDP. So you're talking about a fiscal adjustment that is not quite, but is kind of similar in magnitude to the province's entire spending on education.
Can you remind us what that number is, though, Trevor? Not in percentage, but absolute dollars.
The
I can't
total
remember.
education this year, about 20 billion
Yeah.
this year.
Yeah.
And so you'd need a fiscal adjustment that's not quite that large, but almost that large as a immediate and permanent change in fiscal policy to stabilize debt to GDP. So loading it up
I'm not
all on
thinking
spending is tough.
I'm not thinking you see this happening with a hiring freeze.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And now
A
those,
selective hiring freeze.
but I don't want to end on a doom and gloom note. There
I'm curious, how are you
going
gonna Yes.
So the magic of compound interest, that intuition here kind of applies. Small gradual changes made year after year after year after year can add up. And healthcare is an area that's both large. You know, it's something that in BC's case right now is nearly 40 billion, I think is the number for this year's budget, and 9% of GDP. I might have these numbers wrong, but health spending costs tend to grow by more than inflation, you know, historically about 1% per year faster than inflation. If that can be brought down to have no health specific inflation at all, so health spending would still grow and still grow pretty rapidly with aging as well. But if we just don't have health specific cost increases over and above inflation, and in BC's case, that's it, then the long-term challenge is gone.
Well, the voters would love that.
Well, we're already shutting down emergency rooms, so that's one step in the right
I'm no expert
direction.
in health, so I have no idea how, or even if this is feasible, but it gives you a scale of if you could, like that 1 percentage point on growth, which is big, if sustained, that could do it. Or getting back to the economic option here, boosting growth. How much would you have to boost growth? By about 0.5% a year in terms of labor productivity growth. And that's also really big. So it'll be, I suspect, some combination of a lot of things that added together gets you that 1.8%. And I'm sorry, I completely misspoke. I was looking at the wrong line of the budget. Education is 4.5% of GDP. Social services is the one at 2.5. Sorry.
So that puts that estimate then if 20 billion is 4.5, we're looking more in the vicinity south of 10 billion.
So,
that's right. That's right.
So,
but as an immediate and permanent change.
And unlikely to solve our problems by taxing the rich. Like if we were to jack up income taxes and corporate taxes to much higher levels.
I think we should use every tool in the toolbox, Mike.
I assume there is a law of diminishing returns in terms of how much you push, because that often is relied upon with political rhetoric, right?
Yeah. I'd say that's fair, and it's tough to know where the revenue maximizing tax rate is, and it is contingent entirely on how sensitive you think that top income tax base is. Like if you change the rate, then those taxpayers will change behavior. Maybe they might literally work less, take on fewer clients or what have you. But even if they don't, they might work harder at finding exemptions or ways to shift income. And like legally, they would get a better accountant, let's say. Or they could shift activity to other provincial jurisdictions, or literally move somewhere else, or engage in more evasion, illegal hiding income for tax purposes. So the tax base would shrink. And the best estimate on this for provinces actually comes from Michael Smart, a University of Toronto economist, and Kevin Milligan, someone who I think you probably know at UBC. They estimate that for provinces at that elasticity, we're probably pretty close right now to the revenue maximizing rate of the top income tax nationally. And so it's unlikely to be a source of material revenue increases. But, maybe their estimates are wrong. Maybe the tax base is not as elastic, we say, as they estimate. But it's tough for provinces to have revenue increases for provinces. You have to look at which tax bases have trouble moving from one part of the country to another. And that's consumption or property. It's unfortunately politically the very salient top of mind type of taxes. Property tax is unpopular. Sales tax is unpopular because they're right there front of mind, whereas income taxes are less salient, a little bit more in the background, especially corporate. But there's not a lot of ability for provincial governments to raise revenue with those tools.
So I'm wondering, go ahead, Geoff. Yeah.
No, you go ahead. I want to ask a question though that I thought Mike would ask, and I can't stand the tension.
Well, try it on. Imitate Mike for a second.
Trevor, are we going to get a downgrade? Are we getting a downgrade?
Yeah.
Oh, I will not predict.
Stop biting.
I'll predict
publicly. I'll tell you after. Yeah. No. So credit rating agencies will always review budgets when they come out from different governments. This one will be no different. And this is not a fundamentally different budget than the last one in terms of the pattern of ratcheting up spending, a deteriorating debt position that's accelerating. That was the case before. So how much of past evaluations of the province baked in an expectation of a budget like this? I don't know. If they were taking the government at its word last year, then they were disappointed, and they would probably then downgrade the province. So it's a question of what they were anticipating. We'll see.
Look, I tell you, if they don't get a downgrade, and I don't want a downgrade because it's going to cost me more taxes and all that stuff. But if we don't get a downgrade, then the Ministry of Finance will have a hard time convincing the spenders to not spend. There's got to be some consequence to the borrowing. I mean, when we were in government, it was just we're always if you do this, you're going to have a credit downgrade. That's back when we were 17% debt GDP. Now they're heading towards 35, they better get downgraded. Else who's going to believe these guys anymore?
Yeah, well, independent of the credit rating agencies, the risk premium built into the borrowing costs for the government will rise. Higher debt levels is objectively a riskier financial position to be in. And whether the credit rating agencies reflect that in their rating or not, lenders will in the borrowing rates that they charge. And so it's an interesting, kind of conversation around whether credit rating agencies follow the markets and the yields that are being baked in, or vice versa. And so even if there's not explicitly a downgrade, there still may very well be, and I suspect very likely will be, an increase in borrowing costs for the province because higher debt is riskier. It exposes the jurisdiction to a greater consequence of any future adverse move in economic activity or interest rates.
Well, Trevor, I'm going to call you the kindest economist we've had at Hotel Pacifico. And I'm going to say that for leading with your sympathy for policymakers, and then also for trying to finish us up on a uplifting note. Both things were much appreciated. And it's been a fantastic discussion. Thanks for joining us at Hotel Pacifico.
My pleasure. It was great to be here.
Honorary Maple Ridge economist.
It has come to my attention that I, Gary, the AI-generated voice who shills for air quotes media, am not popular with our listeners on YouTube. Or should I say one listener goes by an alias of cutlery and soiled clothing. Well, suck it, Fork Laundry. This one's for you. Actually, Forky, it's a proposal for everybody, and you're gonna like it. Advertise on air quotes pods, and you can get my nauseating voice off the air. Because your message will be read by one of our influential and human hosts, David Hurley, Kate Hammer, or Mike McDonald. Or just record any piece of creative in your ad agency's fancy production studio and send it to us. Either way, you'll be reaching Canada's most influential listeners at this crucial intersection of politics, and who knows what the fuck happens next? Trump, a new prime minister, new economic policy, a whole new world order. Baby! My data points are tingling. Curse of Politics, the Hurly-Burly, and Hotel Pacifico have the ears of cabinet ministers, elected officials, and the political class, leading journalists, the C-suite, and tens of thousands of engaged Canadians. Oh, and Curse is going daily for the federal election. Prime influence time. So let's do Forky a solid. Email us at contact@airquotesmedia.com to get rid of Gary and get your message to the decision makers.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Okay, I don't know if we actually settled the question there of whether it was an austerity budget, but I'd have to say I feel like Trevor was saying he does not believe it was an austerity budget.
I think there's two ways of looking at it.
It's not an austerity budget.
Not an austerity budget. Geoff?
Well, you can have a lot of spending, which this does, and still face terrible austerity in some ministries, which were zeroed out basically. And I think that's the so much money went into healthcare, and a little bit of money into film and stuff like that. But a lot of key ministries that are just a migraine politically got nothing.
Yeah, and, you know what, Geoff? I put that to somebody the other day, though, in advanced education sector, and said, "Geez, you guys didn't really get much of an update or take up
lift." Yeah.
They said, "Oh no, our collective bargaining will be covered under contingency."
Well, that's collective bargaining, but I know personally a number of instructors have been let go, and Langara is going to go down like 25-30% because of the loss of the revenues on that side, and they're not
for the
backfilled.
international students. Yeah. No, I
think there's a lot bouncing around.
Yeah, I mean, there's non-government revenues that they're losing for sure. Yeah.
So on the spending side, I didn't even notice this that day. I don't think you did either, but there's no forecast allowance. So ever since your time, there was a contingency and a forecast allowance. The prudence, right? We go, well, we're going to.
But I think that contingency is bigger. Don't you think the contingency is bigger now?
Yeah, but
$4 billion.
People I was talking to are going, normally you'd do both.
Yeah.
Anyway,
all right.
Times have changed since the fiscally responsible era of the BC Liberal Party, but moving on.
May they rest in peace.
We never expected to be waiting in cash like that.
Trevor said if tax rates go up, people might have to go get a better accountant. And I just want to state that my accountant is a very loyal listener of Hotel Pacifico and even wears a T-shirt to that effect. And I will not abandon my accountant no matter what the tax rates are. I just want to make that very clear.
Okay.
That's awesome.
And now I'll know if he's still listening because then I might hear this played back to me. So
that's fantastic. Okay, well, this week, more drama to cover. We'll jump into the Conservatives, who had a pretty hectic week with the 3 defections. Felt like
Freaky Friday.
Freaky Friday, we're calling it now. I mean, it is kind of a Freaky Friday because it's a role reversal for John Rustad, right? Like, good reference.
Who did he turn into? Did he turn into a BC Liberal on Freaky Friday?
Yeah, he was like Kevin Falcon. Like, he was the guy
he
watching.
Lost a lot of weight, and I think he'll be glad he did.
Yeah. I mean, so just to say, we had Dallas Brody, Jordan Keeley, Tara Armstrong leaving. I'm curious, because it feels to me like there's probably a couple others who may join before this is done. There's a couple MLAs who seem a little non-committal in their language and their reaction to this. Am I being unfair? Does that seem realistic to you guys?
I think it's possible, and frankly, I think they should have just ripped the Band-Aid off from Brent Chapman. And
he's tough.
That's not going to turn out well with Brent Chapman. I've never met the guy, but his comments damaged the campaign significantly during the election. His wife's the Conservative member of Parliament in South Surrey, so that might be governing his response right now, so it's not to create any more political upset for her, but he's certainly not helping the provincial Conservative ticket, and I think there's a lot of wariness as to it's a matter of time before he just heads over to the trio that are
Well,
sitting there.
and his reaction in particular seemed to be, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said, but it seemed to be he was insinuating that he was waiting for something from Rustad, like some kind of resolution on this, like he wasn't happy with the
Yeah.
status quo, to which I'm like,
Yeah.
no, I don't think that's coming for you. So we'll see. Anyone else, actually, before we move on, anyone else we think who could be next
Well,
in?
I thought it was an interesting back-to-back 2 weeks for Rustad because he, by all accounts, did very well at the convention and elected all the people he
Yeah.
wanted to elect and didn't suffer too many setbacks. And then how could you explain this uproar a week later? And in many respects, I think it was an echo of the convention where Dallas Brody was there. She provoked a direct confrontation with him, challenged the caucus, according to press reports, to vote her out. They obliged, and now the three of them are out. He's rid of some really problematic people. How do they form a party? Of course, there's an incentive there in the legislature's rules to create a party, but parties are onerous. You have to agree with each other on certain things, like when to meet. Somebody has to keep notes. Somebody has to be a leader. And this group looks like they're all just fine right now, being their own person, riding their own hobby horses. And great news for David Eby, who's had the budget, which we've been discussing in this pod at some length, completely overshadowed by Trump. And his opposition now down 3, which is not a huge strategic shift, and it may lead to better
They'll
performance
still
on the
vote
opposition
non-confidence, the three of them. So
Yeah,
when it comes
well,
down to it,
now he's got the
Yeah.
Green Party, which he carries around on his back with this. It's not a CAS agreement; it's a CARP agreement or something.
Well,
But
it's such an
you know.
important point, though, Jeff. It'd be such a different context. We didn't have Trump and we didn't have the conservative drama. Like the story out of this budget would have been really hard for the EB government, I think. And I think they were going to get it on both sides. They were going to get like a lot of discussion about the debt to GDP ratio. And there's a lineup of people who are ready to complain and say, hey, I wasn't in here, So it would have been a tough budget for them. And really,
Well, they
we're
would
to
have had
see
the
some
Mike
of this.
McDonalds in one ear saying you're spending too much, and the Geoff Meggs in
Exactly.
the other saying it's an austerity budget. It would have been a very different conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that debate will come because they will have to respond under these very straitened circumstances to whatever the tariff issues are. And then they've got a $4 billion contingency. How far will that go in the face of collective bargaining and so on? We really don't know.
Okay.
so can we just go back to Rustad though?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, good old Rustad, sorry.
No, more and more.
more. Look, he had a brutal choice to make
Yeah.
last week,
Yeah.
and he only had one choice to make, which was like deal with Dallas Brody and the resulting fallout. So I think he made the right choice. Now we can certainly talk about why did he get in that position in the first place, and the vetting of candidates and so on and so forth. That's fair game, fair comment. But I think if he had not dealt with Dallas Brody and had doubled down on free speech, then there would have been implosion within caucus on the moderate side.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And there would be probably 10 or 15 or more MLAs walking out the back door. So he did that, and now that he's made this decision and he's, firewalled or maybe not firewalled off this group on the right that, if it manifests itself at the next election, may nibble 3 or 4 points off of his margin. He now has to tack more to the center, or tack to more of a charm offensive to people that they have shown not a lot of interest in attracting as candidates thus far. And so that'll be interesting to see how they respond strategically. But the Rustad formula of like, I'm going to defend you and your viewpoint and your right to say it is now found to have limits. And how comfortable will everyone be with those limits on that side of the spectrum? And will people in the other side of it say, okay, at least he has limits. Is that enough for me? I'm not sure.
I mean, I wonder whether, like, some of what I see here is I could see Rustad standing by the free speech line if what had happened with Dallas Brody is she had made the comments about unmarked graves and their verification and sort of left it at that. But when challenged, she doubled down and made it very personal about one member of their caucus, one Indigenous member of their caucus. And that just like that.
And Elia Warbus made it very personal too, where she just said,
Well,
I
of
don't know
course
what
it's
I'm
personal
doing
for
here.
her. Of
Well,
course
yeah,
it's personal for
well,
her.
exactly. But I mean, it was very compelling what she said, right? And she said, I don't know, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but I don't know what I'm doing here unless this gets dealt with, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. All right, let's stay on this actually, because I think we have a clipping. We have a clipping that relates to the chaos in the Conservative Party from Alec Lazenby, writing in the Vancouver Sun on former Peace River North MLA Dan Davies reacting to Jordan Keeley's departure from the Conservative caucus. And I'm just going to read directly because I have to say, this is one of the funnest quotes I've read in a while. Quote, Davies said he is disappointed to see his opponent abandon his party after using the Conservative platform to springboard him from the legislature. To the legislature. To the legislature, not from. Very important distinction.
you see, he also springboarded from the caucus. But anyway.
Yeah, and Andy did both. But in this case, we're using the point of in. He said when he ran as an independent, it was after 8 years of building up relationships in the legislature, and that he worries Keeley won't be able to effectively represent his community as part of a caucus of 3 with no party behind them. Quote, I mean, for crying out loud, he's been in the building for 3 weeks, and he's already jumping ship because someone ruffled his feathers. End quote, said Davies. We have someone who is an independent with little to no connections. So just to say it, like Davies is reacting there to the fact that he ran in Peace River North as an independent. And I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, right? But I think
well, Jordan Keeley, who has shown some sympathy for chemtrails, Dan Davies chemtrailed him by 52 points in that election. I think it was like 72-20 or something like that.
Yeah.
So Dan Davies is probably a little chagrined here, thinking like, I just got smoked by this guy, and now he's not even sticking around as a conservative.
No, now he's going to be an independent anyway.
The voters wanted a conservative.
Yeah. Rode the coattails of the brand in, and then lasted 3 weeks in that brand. Like, it's a fair point.
Well, we'll see if we get another party. Honestly, I raised that earlier, but the incentive is there in the legislature rules. But none of these people show any indication they want to work with anybody else. And they have their salary locked down now for 4 years. Recall's very, very difficult. It'll be very interesting to see if some kind of other organization emerges on the right, or there's just some kind of free-floating group of people who, as Mike says, vote with the Conservatives when they see it as a good idea.
So there's a true believer syndrome. And those who started with the Conservatives when they were small, some can make the transition into a larger party. I did. I was with the BC Liberals when they were like less than 7% in the polls, and I kept going, as did a lot of others. But some didn't, because they just couldn't handle, just didn't want to grow with the party. They were a little more stubborn about why they were there in a small party to begin with. Same thing's happening with the Conservatives right now. There's some that will be uncompromising about the things that have to be done by a winning political party. And those 3 are representative, and there will be probably more. And there's certainly grassroots people. There's certainly Tim Thielman, who is now supporting these 3 MLAs. We pumped his tires during the campaign for his social media stuff, but since then he's been fired by the caucus, and he's ran for president, lost to Asia Esty, and now he's showing up with these 3. So there are people like that who say, I cannot work within this framework. I will not make compromises. I want to be true to myself. And I would also argue, Geoff, that maybe the federal NDP has an element of that too, where that holds it back from being a true national contender.
I think that's a fair comment. Yeah.
So the true believers, you know what? Some aren't going to make the transition, and that's okay. And keep on trucking. You got to keep your eye on the ball to form a winning coalition. That's what it's all about. And BC Liberals back in the early 90s, they had to say, we got on board some Stoke Grids. We got on board some federal Conservatives. Else we're not going to make it. And that comes with some collateral damage.
Is this, I mean, and I asked this to 2 gentlemen I know to be, the political history, Canadian political history Wikipedia pages. If we were to look at other incidences where there have been a defection, a couple of defections from a party, this strikes me from my memory as one that is one of the most self-inflicted. I can think of instances as sort of events and a point of principle, or maybe the geography of where you represent might not fit with a decision. This one, a comment you didn't need to make, like, it feels self-inflicted by comparison. Is that fair, or can we think of others that maybe look a bit like this one?
Well, I look at social media and a pandemic where people wound up in basically echo machines, able to connect for the first time on Zoom and all kinds of things. People who had views they were more aligned with and got reinforced there. And I feel that there's an element of that playing out here. Obscure issues, frankly, very obscure issues, like the guy who's still in the BC Conservatives, the doctor who they decided not to run, who believes there's some kind of magnetism associated with vaccines. There's still some very, novel views among the conservative activists. Thielman's an interesting example too, because he looked like a credible candidate, but he's overtly fostering division inside the Conservative Party on behalf of whatever cause, I don't know. I'm not sure what it is, but he had a strange tweet on saying, "So it begins," as if he was the concert master at some unfolding opera. And I think it's a good idea. I totally agree with Mike. Rustad wouldn't have lasted another week if he hadn't thrown those people out. If more leave, that's one thing. Maybe more people will have to be thrown out. But I do think that people like Dallas Brody, to the degree that I can rationalize her comments, and they were terrible, is that there's some kind of badge of courage of having a completely outrageous viewpoint and proclaiming it that way, and then insisting it's everybody else who's wrong when you get in trouble for it. And I haven't seen that before.
I think they overestimate their followership sometimes, the dissidents, right?
Which is easy to do, in this context.
Because you're so fired up, and then it's like, okay, everybody, let's go. It's like, where are you?
Yeah.
Well, it's also a cop out. If you, and I think Davy's quote is interesting in that regard. If you want to form government, you would rather be in government than in opposition. But opposition is work. It requires sitting down and preparing stuff. But if you're an independent, it's great. You get paid. You don't have to do anything.
So let's just take a look.
Are you campaigning to try and get some of them to move over there, Geoff? This is Geoff Meggs' pitch to the Conservative members who are on the
No, I think in some respects, Davies has pointed to the fact that if they were really interested in changing things according to the platform they ran on, they would behave differently. And as it is, they're quitters. That's what I think is happening. And they were troublesome quitters who were looking for a way to get thrown out. And it worked. And good riddance, frankly, for everybody in the politics. And Warbus, was extremely dignified, but outraged in her response. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to talk about Quilchena for a second, because Dallas Brody represents Vancouver Quilchena, and I did feel it was a missed opportunity during the RIP period, albeit the timing was very constrained, that there was no independent moderate running in Quilchena, because I thought that was the one seat that there was a chance, because that has been one of the first seats that a moderate free enterpriser would win, would be Quilchena. It's been federal liberal for over 40 years. And they didn't put it together. So the voters had basically a binary choice. Well, they had a Green, they had an NDP, or they had a Conservative. They went with the Conservative. There's no way Dallas Brody's winning that seat back next time, under any circumstances, obviously. I would suggest about a year from now, when the recall provisions click in, that that may not ultimately be successful, but I would not be surprised if somebody tries to launch a recall petition, because she's totally out of line with the typical voter base in Quilchena, with where she's taken this. And who knows, maybe she'll decide the legislature's not for her, and we'll see a by-election. But that's, if that riding, if someone's looking to restart the BC Liberals, that's restart. That's the
great point. It's a great point. Can I pick that up, because I think that's a great entrance into the discussion about what's happening federally. Right. So now we've got a new leader for the federal Liberals in Mark Carney, and certainly some kind of realignment happening. I think still a bit of a question to what degree, but the lead that the federal Conservatives had over the federal Liberals is shrinking, and where it lands still a bit of a question. But I want to bring this back to BC. And the question too of, certainly if the NDP's numbers federally remain as low as they are, there's a bunch of ridings in BC that I think are going to be of great interest to the Conservatives and the Liberals. So what does that mean for what those parties need to do? Let's start with the Liberals. Like, what do they need to be do to looking at some of these ridings, getting the efficiency they need, I think, out of the provinces like BC?
I think they had a good outcome last time. They had a great outcome in 2015. They fell back in 2019, but they reclaimed some of those seats in 2021. And I think they probably see the current level that they were elected with in 2019 as their universe, or pretty close to it. So I think it's how do you hold as many of those seats as possible? I'm not sure I see any pickups that they didn't win last time. And there might be with the boundary changes. There maybe I'm missing one, but
Yeah, well, and like some of those kind of Burnaby type seats, like if the NDP are at historic lows, do they become live in a new way, or am I?
well, I mean, I don't see Peter Julian or Jagmeet Singh's seats as liberal targets. I think they've got enough work to do to save Terry Beach. They're probably
What
feeling
about
good about. Well, I think they feel probably good with Jonathan Wilkinson and the Vancouver seats mainly that they have. Richmond's going to be tough for them against the Conservatives. Delta will be tough against the Conservatives, but they'll want to hold Surrey. Like they've got 3 seats in Surrey. They lost one in a by-election. Saving Surrey is a priority because that's an important beachhead for them south of the Fraser River. They also have a seat in the Tri-Cities. There's going to be Ian Black's contesting, and that's going to be really tough for the Liberals to hold. So
what about South Island, Mike, where you've got a couple of Democrats who are leaving, one staying, I think.
I don't. There's always a bit of optimism. The Liberals may. David Anderson held the seat there for a long time, but David Anderson was a really iconic figure. And unless they have a superstar candidate running in Victoria, I think it's the NDP will probably hold on to seats like Victoria that are, have a real lefty vibe to it right now. And the Conservatives can't win there. But when you get to Esquimalt, it's the Conservatives that'll be the problem.
Yeah,
And
that's
then
what I thought too.
all the way up the island, it'll be the Conservatives taking seats from the NDP. Maybe not all of them, but they'll be taking an Aaron Gunn sized chunk out of
Right,
the
Campbell
NDP
River, yeah,
caucus.
North Island.
I mean, to bring it back to your, what did you say? Save Surrey point, though, Mike. If the federal Conservatives are looking at the result in October in BC, and if we buy I'll call it the working thesis that there's a tighter and tighter relationship between federal and provincial politics in the minds of voters, I think they're feeling pretty good about their odds in Surrey.
The Conservatives?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I did. It's hard to say. I mean, like 3 months ago, it would have been like, yeah, it's gonna be a smoke show, right? And
Right. Everything's changed. Yeah. Right.
I do think the Carney effect has certainly been good for the Liberals, and there's certainly a lot of polling optimism. But I do feel like where he's really strong is like affluent white collar Liberals, professional managerial class. I'm not sure to the extent that Liberal surge plays in the burbs. It may. I just I think that's where the collision is going to happen between the Conservatives and the Liberals. And we saw in the by-election, when Justin was still around, that the Liberals absolutely got demolished in Cloverdale, Langley, in that by-election. So could they win that seat in a general election? I'd be surprised.
Yeah.
But anyways, I think the Conservatives, from their end of things, I think they've got to be feeling pretty good about the island. They got to be feeling like they can nibble away at a few NDP seats in the interior. They definitely want to get Ellis Ross elected. But where the rubber hit the road is in those seats in and around Vancouver, like Richmond, Coquitlam, Surrey, Delta. That's where their opportunity lies.
And what about the
I think
NDP, Geoff? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say briefly about Carney and then come back to the NDP. I think that Carney's is still unknown, and that's helpful. And he's been very successful in capturing the support of the anti-Poilievre forces in Canadian politics, who were mostly in the Liberal Party. The turnout wasn't that great. I worry that he is not going to have the populist touch, which is part of this whole argument with Trump. He seems quiet to me. He doesn't seem like he's really well, I know he's not experienced. He's not experienced politically, and that may not be a problem. But I agree with those on the hurly-burly and elsewhere who say it probably will be. Jagmeet Singh is, how many elections is this? He's got to figure out a way to differentiate himself from from the Liberals and demonstrate that there's a value to having the NDP there, that it's got a role to play. Whereas we hear a lot of on the street interviews with people and voters who are saying, normally I love the NDP, but I got to defeat this guy, Poilievre, so I'm going to have to go with the Liberals. It's very difficult to break through that, and the NDP caucus is scattered across the country. There's more here in BC than in any other particular place. So I think it's going to be difficult for them to knit together a national message, although they've got some very good experienced campaigners to do that.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about this. For now, we can grab a drink.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
I'm going to raise a glass to George Heyman, who used to be the environment minister. And my sources tell me that he may play a role on behalf of the government as a special kind of intermediary of some kind during the collective bargaining process, which has already started with the BC Government Employees Union. Very, very difficult and challenging task. And so if he's taken it on, good on you, brother. I think you're going to have a lot of long nights ahead, but George Heyman, in the service of the public purse and good outcomes in bargaining, apparently will be doing that kind of an intermediary role. So if so, that's great news.
Nice. Mike?
I will raise a glass to the legislative internship program. I attended the 50th anniversary on the weekend at the legislature and at Government House. So it was kind of very nice to connect with those great institutions. George Abbott was the after-dinner speaker, fresh in his new role as whatever he is, treaty commissioner or head of the treaty process. George Abbott is a very funny guy, and he is his wit is so dry it's practically dehydrated. But he was getting a lot of laughs, tailored to a very nerdy crowd. But also at that event, I had the occasion to meet Grace Lohr, and who was herself an intern, I think 2006, 2008. And that was, I've never met her before, so it was great to see her out at that event, and obviously wishing her well. Also, just to name drop some more, the clerk of the House, Kate Ryan Lloyd, played a big role at the dinner, and great to talk to her, and maybe we'll see her around Hotel Pacifico one of these days. But lots of, over 500 people have gone through the internship program over the last 50 years. And a lot of people have ended up in public service, elected life, or private sector, whatever. But definitely have been a great program for a lot of people. And Geoff, I believe you've got a family connection to the internship program as well.
Caitlin went. Enjoyed it very much.
So it's where our parents put us to keep us out of trouble.
So there was no Maple Ridge campus. You had to go all the way to Victoria.
I had to not have a Maple Ridge internship program. That's what Trevor Tombe must have gone to and learned about finances. I learned about politics instead.
So you said it was the 50th anniversary, Mike. So
yeah,
there's alum going back to the 70s.
George Abbott was in the first year.
Whoa! Oh, I love that. Okay, that's
claims
cool.
to be at the 100th anniversary too.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna pull a move. I don't know if I've pulled this yet. In the minibar, doing a double barrel.
Permitting? Do you want to talk about permitting?
Oh God. I feel like I've spent
how much time do we have?
I know on that one. No, I'm gonna keep it a little more chill. Well, no, but I'm still angry. I am going to take a shot at the budget, and I'm going to take the shot at the budget for not including childcare, like not even mentioning it. And I say this like not naively about the cost.
No money, Kate. There's no money.
I know.
Budget.
But the federal taps are still on, and there's still work you can do, particularly in building out the workforce and some other pieces. So I just would have liked to have seen it. So I'm not happy. And I know a lot of others aren't. And then I'm going to raise my glass, and I'm going to raise a glass to Aaliyah Warbus. I have to say, I think it's easy to lose track of the fact that there is a lot of hand-wringing. This has happened to a couple, I think, of the newer Conservative caucus members who get flack for aspects of their identity, whether they're Indigenous or whether they're lesbian. there are other examples. And they get flack and told, how can you be part of that party? And I think that is so unfair. And I think Aaliyah Warvis entered politics with some of that, and then has been on a ride ever since. That is, I think, really put some tough situations to her that she continues to handle with a lot of grace. And she's really young and she's new at this. And I am seriously impressed by how she continues to manage this. So my glass is raised to her.
Okay.
All right. Gosh. All right. There's another one. Another one in the bag. Thank you. I want to thank our guest, Trevor Tombe, for joining us today. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS and Fortis BC. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Check out time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.